"Sir, your invitation is not valid. You will need to leave." The words sliced through the elegant entrance of Ashford Manor just as another luxury sedan pulled beneath the covered driveway. Conversations paused. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of chandelier light spilling through the tall windows, while guests dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns instinctively turned toward the unexpected exchange. Standing calmly at the entrance was Nathaniel Brooks, a black man in his early 40s wearing a perfectly fitted navy suit, polished leather shoes, and a simple silver watch. Nothing about him appeared out of place except for the fact that someone had decided he did not belong. He held a cream-colored invitation between two fingers without arguing or raising his voice. The young woman managing guest check-in offered an uncomfortable smile before looking back down at the digital guest list on her tablet. She searched once. Then again. Finally, she looked up and shook her head. "I am sorry, sir. I cannot find your name." Nathaniel nodded politely. "Please check one more time." She did exactly that, scrolling carefully through every reservation while a growing line of distinguished guests waited behind him. Soft whispers drifted through the entrance like invisible currents. "Wrong event," one man quietly muttered to his wife. Another guest glanced toward Nathaniel before saying, "These private tastings are invitation only." A woman carrying a crystal wine glass offered a sympathetic smile that somehow felt more dismissive than kind. "It happens," she said. "Sometimes people misunderstand these exclusive events." Nathaniel listened without responding. He had learned years ago that dignity often spoke louder than explanation. The evening air carried the rich scent of oak barrels and fresh garden roses from the estate courtyard, but beneath the elegance lingered something less refined. Assumptions had begun fermenting long before anyone bothered to ask a genuine question. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we are glad you are here. Now, back to Nathaniel Brooks. The event host, Richard Collins, noticed the growing delay and walked confidently toward the entrance with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to welcoming influential guests. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The receptionist lowered her voice. "His name is not in the system." Richard looked Nathaniel up and down for only a brief moment before offering a professional smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Sir, I appreciate your interest in tonight's tasting, but this is a private gathering for confirmed guests and invited partners only." Nathaniel extended the invitation card. "I understand. That is why I am here." Richard accepted the card, studied it briefly, then handed it back. "Without your name in our records, I cannot allow entry." Around them, several guests pretended not to watch while listening to every word. A few quietly stepped aside, creating an uncomfortable space around Nathaniel as though exclusion itself were contagious. Yet Nathaniel neither protested nor walked away. Instead, he looked beyond the entrance toward the softly illuminated ballroom where laughter, music, and polished glasses reflected an evening built upon appearances. He checked the time on his watch, inhaled slowly, and remained exactly where he stood, leaving everyone wondering why a man so calm seemed completely certain that this story was far from over. Nathaniel Brooks remained at the entrance with the same quiet composure that had unsettled everyone more than any raised voice ever could. Richard Collins folded his hands politely in front of him and offered another practiced smile. "Sir, I understand this is frustrating, but I cannot make exceptions for private events." Nathaniel met his eyes without irritation. "I am not asking for an exception. I am asking for accuracy." The sentence lingered in the evening air. Around them, arriving guests slowed their pace just enough to observe without appearing obvious. A gentleman carrying a polished wooden wine case leaned toward his companion and whispered, if his invitation were real, they would have let him in already. The woman beside him nodded almost instinctively. It was remarkable how quickly certainty could grow from so little information. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the ballroom beyond the entrance. Elegant string music drifted through the open doors. Servers moved gracefully between polished tables where rare bottles waited beneath carefully focused lighting. Every detail reflected refinement, exclusivity, and tradition. Yet standing only a few feet outside those doors, Nathaniel had already become the evening's quiet spectacle. The receptionist searched the guest database once again, this time entering his last name manually. She frowned. "I still cannot find anything." Richard looked relieved by the confirmation. "There you have it." Nathaniel accepted the answer without visible disappointment. Instead, he calmly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed his phone. He unlocked the screen, read a recent message for several seconds, then slipped the device back into his pocket without making a call. That simple action immediately attracted fresh speculation. "Maybe he is trying to contact whoever sold him the invitation," one guest murmured. Another quietly laughed. "That is assuming it was ever real." Nathaniel heard every comment but refused to let them alter his expression. He had spent decades building companies, leading negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and mentoring young entrepreneurs across the country. None of those accomplishments had erased moments like this. Success could change an address, a title, or a balance sheet. It could not always change the assumptions made before a conversation even began. Richard took one respectful step closer. "Sir, I truly do not wish to embarrass you. If someone invited you by mistake, I would be happy to help you contact them tomorrow." Nathaniel smiled politely. "The person who invited me expected me tonight." Richard gently shook his head. "Then perhaps they forgot to complete the registration." Several nearby guests quietly agreed, grateful to have found an explanation that required no further questions. Nathaniel simply checked the time on his watch. 7:12 in the evening. His calm confidence puzzled the young receptionist more with every passing minute. Most people denied entry became angry, defensive, or impatient. Nathaniel did none of those things. He neither demanded special treatment nor attempted to force his way inside. He merely waited, as though he knew something everyone else had overlooked. From across the lobby, a junior event coordinator named Emily Carter watched the exchange while organizing welcome packets for arriving guests. Something about Nathaniel's face seemed strangely familiar. She could not remember where she had seen him before, but the feeling refused to disappear. As Richard prepared to welcome the next arriving guests, Emily quietly opened her laptop and began searching through archived planning emails, unaware that the answer she was about to find would change the entire evening. Emily Carter quietly stepped away from the welcome table and opened the event planning folder on her laptop, careful not to attract attention from Richard Collins or the growing crowd near the entrance. She searched through confirmation emails, sponsorship documents, and guest correspondence while the elegant reception continued only a few feet away. Soft piano music filled the ballroom, waitstaff carried polished trays of sparkling water, and conversations about vineyards and rare vintages floated through the air. Yet just outside those grand doors, another conversation had become far more interesting. Nathaniel Brooks remained exactly where he had been, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, and his confidence untouched by the whispers surrounding him. The longer he stood there without arguing, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. One guest adjusted his cufflinks before quietly saying, "If I were in his position, I would have left by now." Another replied, "Maybe he is hoping someone important will recognize him." A woman standing nearby smiled politely but added, "Sometimes people have trouble accepting that they made a mistake." Nathaniel heard every word without responding. Silence had become one of the strongest forms of discipline he possessed. Richard Collins welcomed another arriving couple with the same warmth he had denied Nathaniel only moments before. The contrast did not go unnoticed by several observers, although none chose to mention it aloud. Emily continued scrolling through archived messages until one subject line immediately caught her attention. It had been sent 3 weeks earlier by the Executive Planning Committee. She opened it quickly, reading each line more carefully than the last. Her eyes widened for only a moment before she searched the attached files, but when she opened the updated guest registry, the name she expected to find was missing. Confused, she checked an earlier version of the document. There it was. Nathaniel Brooks. Listed near the very top with a special notation beside his name. Before she could read the remaining details, Richard approached her table. "Emily, is everything ready inside?" She quickly minimized the file. "Almost. I am just verifying a few records." Richard nodded and returned toward the entrance without another question. Emily reopened the document immediately. The notation beside Nathaniel's name referenced a revised guest list distributed only 2 days earlier, but the updated file somehow no longer included him. She searched through her inbox again, looking for an explanation. Nothing made sense. Nathaniel was clearly expected during the earliest planning stages, yet somewhere between revisions his reservation had disappeared. Whether it was a technical mistake or an administrative oversight, she could not tell. Across the entrance, Richard once again faced Nathaniel. "Sir, I believe we have delayed our other guests long enough. I respectfully need to ask you to step aside so the evening may continue." Nathaniel looked at him with the same composed expression. "I have no desire to interrupt your event." Richard smiled politely. "Then I appreciate your cooperation." Nathaniel glanced once more toward the ballroom, then at his watch. 7:17. He neither argued nor moved. That quiet decision unsettled Richard more than open confrontation would have. Emily looked from her laptop to Nathaniel, then back to the document glowing on her screen. She knew she had discovered something important, but before she could gather the confidence to speak, another luxury vehicle pulled into the circular driveway, and everyone instinctively turned toward the arrival of the evening's next distinguished guest. The black luxury sedan came to a smooth stop beneath the covered entrance, and every conversation near the doorway paused for just a moment before returning to the familiar rhythm of polite introductions and quiet laughter. A distinguished couple stepped from the vehicle, greeted warmly by Richard Collins, who welcomed them with effortless enthusiasm before personally escorting them toward the ballroom. Nathaniel Brooks watched the exchange without resentment. He simply stood with the same calm posture that had defined the entire evening, his invitation still resting neatly in his hand. The contrast between the effortless welcome extended to arriving guests and the suspicion directed toward him had become impossible to ignore, even for those who preferred not to say anything aloud. Emily Carter stared at the archived document still glowing on her laptop. She enlarged the attachment one more time, carefully reading every line to make certain she had not misunderstood what she had found. Nathaniel Brooks had indeed appeared on the original executive guest registry. Beside his name was a note indicating that additional arrival instructions would be provided directly by the organizing committee. Yet somehow, in the most recent registration file, both his name and the notation had disappeared entirely. Emily searched through every revision history she could access, hoping to discover who had removed the entry, but the system only showed that an updated guest list had been uploaded 2 days earlier. No explanation accompanied the change. She quietly looked toward Nathaniel again. The confidence in his expression did not resemble someone attempting to enter an event without permission. Instead, it looked like someone patiently waiting for a missing piece to arrive. Richard returned from greeting the latest guests and noticed that Nathaniel still had not left the entrance. His smile became noticeably tighter. "Sir," he said in a courteous but firmer tone, "I appreciate your patience, but we have already checked every available record." Nathaniel nodded. "I understand." Richard folded his hands. "Then I respectfully ask that you allow our invited guests to continue enjoying the evening." Nathaniel looked briefly toward the ballroom before answering. "That is exactly what I intend to do." The response confused Richard even more than before. Around them, several guests exchanged puzzled glances. One gentleman quietly whispered, "Why does he keep acting as though he belongs here?" His companion answered just as quietly, "Because he probably believes someone will eventually come looking for him." Neither realized how close that assumption might actually be. Emily finally gathered enough courage to leave her desk and approach Richard. She lowered her voice so the surrounding guests could not hear. "I think there may have been an error with an earlier guest list." Richard barely glanced toward her. "Emily, we already verified everything." She hesitated before continuing. His name appeared in the original planning documents. Richard sighed softly. If it is not in the final registry, then it is not valid. We cannot question the official list every time someone arrives with a story. Emily looked back toward Nathaniel, feeling increasingly certain that this was not a misunderstanding that would simply disappear. Nathaniel checked the time once again. 7:22. His phone remained silent in his pocket, yet there was no sign of concern on his face. He simply waited with remarkable confidence, as though he trusted that truth had its own schedule. Inside the ballroom, crystal glasses were raised for the opening remarks, but before Richard could step away from the entrance to begin the evening, the mobile phone clipped to his jacket vibrated sharply. He glanced at the screen, and the confident expression he had worn all night began to fade before he even answered the call. Richard Collins looked down at the vibrating phone clipped to his jacket, expecting another routine question from the catering staff or the event coordinator. Instead, the caller identification displayed only the words Executive Office. He hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Richard Collins speaking. The voice on the other end sounded calm, direct, and unmistakably authoritative. Has Mr. Nathaniel Brooks arrived? Richard glanced toward the entrance where Nathaniel still stood with quiet patience. There is a gentleman by that name here, Richard replied carefully, but there appears to be an issue with the guest list. A brief silence followed. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. Finally, the voice asked, "Is he inside the ballroom?" Richard answered honestly. "No, he is still at the entrance because we could not verify his invitation." Another pause settled over the call before the response came, slower than before. "Then your evening has not officially begun." Richard blinked in confusion. "I am sorry?" The caller continued without raising his voice. "Please keep Mr. Brooks there. Do not allow the opening presentation to proceed until I arrive." The line disconnected. Richard slowly lowered the phone without saying a word. Emily Carter noticed the color drain slightly from his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. Richard looked toward Nathaniel again, this time with uncertainty replacing confidence. Around them, guests continued sipping sparkling water and admiring the carefully displayed wine collection, unaware that something significant had just shifted behind the scenes. Nathaniel remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged. It was almost as though he had expected the call to come eventually. Richard walked back toward him, choosing his words more carefully than before. "Mr. Brooks, would you mind waiting just a little longer?" Nathaniel offered a polite nod. "I have been waiting." Richard forced a courteous smile, but his thoughts were no longer as settled as they had been only minutes earlier. Emily stepped beside him and quietly whispered, "Who was on the phone?" Richard kept his eyes on Nathaniel. "The executive office." Emily's eyebrows lifted. "Did they mention him?" Richard hesitated before answering. "They asked whether he had arrived before they asked about anything else." Emily looked back at Nathaniel with growing curiosity. The archived guest list, the missing reservation, and now the unexpected phone call no longer seemed like unrelated coincidences. They felt like pieces of the same puzzle finally beginning to fit together. Nearby, several guests noticed that Richard had stopped welcoming new arrivals and was instead watching the quiet man at the entrance. Whispered conversations resumed. "Why is the host suddenly acting differently?" one guest asked. Another shrugged. "Maybe they found his reservation after all." Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the ballroom where the opening remarks had now been delayed without explanation. Years earlier he might have felt the familiar sting of standing outside doors that seemed to close before anyone learned his name. He remembered being 28 years old, arriving at an executive fundraising gala after making the largest corporate donation of the evening, only to be mistaken for hired staff because he had chosen a simple dark suit instead of an expensive tuxedo. That memory had taught him something he never forgot. Respect that depends on appearances is never genuine. Since then, he had stopped chasing approval and started trusting character instead. Back at Ashford Manor, the elegant music continued playing while confusion quietly spread through the entrance. For the first time that evening, Nathaniel was no longer the only person waiting. Richard Collins now found himself waiting as well, uncertain who would walk through the next set of doors and why one unexpected phone call had suddenly made the most important guest at the event the very man he had refused to welcome. The atmosphere inside Ashford Manor shifted almost imperceptibly. Guests continued admiring the carefully arranged collection of rare vintages, yet the easy confidence that had filled the entrance only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Richard Collins checked his watch twice within the same minute, something Emily Carter had never seen him do during an event. He kept glancing toward the circular driveway as though expecting someone whose arrival suddenly mattered more than every distinguished guest already inside the ballroom. Nathaniel Brooks remained near the entrance, his posture relaxed, his hands loosely folded in front of him. He neither demanded an explanation nor reminded anyone about the conversation that had taken place only moments before. His silence carried a quiet assurance that puzzled everyone around him. Emily stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Mr. Brooks, may I ask you something?" Nathaniel smiled politely. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking. "Were you expecting that phone call?" Nathaniel looked briefly toward the evening sky beyond the estate before answering. "I was expecting the truth to arrive eventually. How it arrived was never my decision." Emily nodded slowly. The answer revealed almost nothing, yet somehow explained everything. Richard walked toward the ballroom entrance and quietly instructed the musicians to continue playing another selection instead of beginning the official welcome. Several guests exchanged curious looks. One executive approached Richard with a puzzled expression. "I thought the tasting was scheduled to begin at 7:15. Richard forced a courteous smile. "We are waiting for one final arrival." The executive looked around the room. "I thought everyone was already here." Richard did not answer. His attention had already returned to Nathaniel. The irony was impossible to ignore. The man he had politely refused at the door had somehow become the very reason the evening could not move forward. Whispered conversations spread once again through the reception hall. "Who exactly is that man?" one guest asked quietly. Another shrugged. "Apparently someone important enough to delay the entire event." A third guest added, "If that is true, why was he standing outside all this time?" No one had an answer. Nathaniel checked the time on his watch. 7:27. His expression remained peaceful, almost reflective. For a brief moment he remembered another evening years earlier at a private charity auction in Chicago. He had arrived early after anonymously funding scholarships for hundreds of first-generation college students. The organizers had mistaken him for event staff and asked whether he could help move chairs before the guests arrived. He had smiled, helped arrange the room, and never corrected anyone until the closing presentation revealed the identity of the evening's principal benefactor. That experience had taught him something success could never purchase. Titles disappear the moment people stop reading name badges. Character remains long after introductions end. The memory faded as headlights appeared at the end of the long driveway leading toward the estate. A black executive sedan rolled slowly beneath the entrance canopy, and the uniformed valet immediately stepped aside with unusual urgency. Richard straightened his jacket almost instinctively. Emily closed her laptop. Conversations across the lobby softened into silence. Nathaniel looked toward the arriving vehicle with the calm expression of someone greeting an expected guest rather than awaiting a surprise. The rear door opened, and an older gentleman in an impeccably tailored suit stepped onto the stone walkway carrying nothing except a leather portfolio. Before acknowledging anyone else, he looked directly at Nathaniel with a warm smile, then began walking toward him while Richard suddenly realized the next few moments would determine whether his reputation as host had just reached its highest point or its lowest. The older gentleman crossed the polished stone entrance with quiet confidence, and before anyone could greet him, he extended his hand toward Nathaniel Brooks with the familiarity of someone welcoming a respected colleague rather than meeting a guest. "Nathaniel," he said warmly, "I apologize for the delay. Traffic was less cooperative than the vineyards." Nathaniel smiled and accepted the handshake. Good to see you again, William. Richard Collins froze where he stood. Emily Carter watched the exchange without blinking. Every whispered assumption that had filled the entrance during the past half hour suddenly seemed painfully fragile. William Harrison, chairman of the National Heritage Wine Alliance and the man responsible for organizing the exclusive tasting tour across the country, turned toward Richard with a puzzled expression. Richard, why is Mr. Brooks still standing outside? Richard struggled to answer. There appeared to be a problem with the guest registry. William's expression became noticeably more serious. A problem with the registry? He looked back at Nathaniel before continuing. Nathaniel accepted my personal invitation nearly a month ago. Richard glanced toward Emily, then back at William. His name was not on the final guest list. William slowly opened the leather portfolio he had carried beneath his arm. Inside rested several printed schedules, sponsorship summaries, and the original executive invitation package. He carefully removed the first page and handed it to Richard. At the top, highlighted in bold letters, was Nathaniel Brooks. Beneath his name appeared another notation that instantly explained why the executive office had called earlier. Guest of honor. Opening speaker. Strategic funding partner. Richard felt his throat tighten as he continued reading. Nathaniel had not simply been invited to attend the evening. His foundation had financed the educational initiative that allowed the tasting tour to raise scholarship funds for young entrepreneurs entering the American wine industry. William addressed the gathering guests with calm authority. Ladies and gentlemen, before tonight's first glass is poured, I would like you to meet the man whose generosity helped make this entire series of events possible. Complete silence settled across the entrance. Crystal glasses remained suspended in midair as every eye turned toward Nathaniel. William continued. When many organizations reduced educational funding 3 years ago, Mr. Brooks quietly stepped forward. He never requested his name on advertisements. He declined interviews. He asked for only one thing: that every qualified student receive the opportunity to learn regardless of background or circumstance. Emily looked toward Nathaniel with quiet admiration. She finally understood why his confidence had never faded. He had not been waiting for someone to rescue him. He had simply trusted that truth would eventually introduce itself. William turned back toward Richard. His voice remained composed, but every word carried unmistakable weight. The first question tonight should never have been whether Mr. Brooks belonged here. The first question should have been why a man listed as guest of honor was standing outside your entrance. Richard lowered his eyes, unable to find an answer that could repair what had already happened. Around him, guests who had whispered doubtful comments only minutes earlier now avoided meeting Nathaniel's gaze. The elegant entrance that had once felt exclusive suddenly became a place of quiet reflection instead. Nathaniel looked around the room without satisfaction or resentment. He simply offered William a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said softly. William smiled. "No, Nathaniel. Tonight, this event should be thanking you." In that single moment, the room did not merely discover who Nathaniel Brooks was. It discovered how quickly appearances can blind people to the very character they claim to admire. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The elegant reception hall remained filled with soft music and sparkling crystal, yet the atmosphere had completely transformed. The same guests who had quietly questioned Nathaniel Brooks only moments earlier now looked at him with a mixture of surprise, admiration, and unmistakable regret. Richard Collins slowly lowered the executive documents William Harrison had handed him. Every highlighted page confirmed the same undeniable truth. Nathaniel had not arrived hoping to attend an exclusive evening. He had arrived as one of the people responsible for making that evening possible. Richard took a slow breath before stepping toward Nathaniel. The confidence that had shaped every decision earlier in the evening had been replaced by genuine humility. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged a situation before I understood it, and in doing so, I failed to extend the respect every guest deserves. I am sincerely sorry." Nathaniel looked at Richard for a brief moment before answering. "Thank you for saying that." Richard seemed almost surprised by how calmly those words were received. He had expected frustration, disappointment, perhaps even anger. Instead, he found only quiet dignity. William Harrison gently placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Mistakes happen," he said. "What defines us is whether we learn from them." Emily Carter stepped forward holding the earlier guest registry she had discovered. "Mr. Brooks," she said with a respectful smile, "I knew something did not make sense. I am sorry I did not speak sooner." Nathaniel accepted the document and smiled warmly. "You searched for the truth when it would have been easier to accept the first answer. That matters more than you realize." Emily's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. Around them, several guests slowly approached Nathaniel one by one. The same gentleman who had quietly assumed Nathaniel belonged at the wrong event extended his hand. "I owe you an apology as well," he admitted. "I formed an opinion without introducing myself." Nathaniel shook his hand graciously. Introductions are always a better beginning than assumptions. A woman carrying a crystal wine glass stepped forward next. "Your foundation helped my niece receive a scholarship last year," she said softly after hearing William's remarks. "We never knew who made that possible." Nathaniel smiled. The opportunity mattered more than the recognition. Those words spread through the room almost as quickly as the earlier whispers had. Only this time, the conversation sounded different. Guests spoke not about appearances but about generosity, leadership, and quiet service. Richard turned toward the reception staff. "Before we continue, I would like everyone to welcome our guest of honor properly." The employees immediately opened the grand entrance doors wider, not as a gesture of ceremony but as a visible correction of what should have happened from the beginning. Nathaniel walked forward at William's invitation while every conversation respectfully paused. No applause had been requested, yet a warm round of appreciation gradually filled the ballroom. It was not loud or theatrical. It felt sincere. Richard looked across the gathering and spoke with quiet conviction. "Tonight has reminded all of us that exclusivity should never come at the expense of basic respect. Credentials can be verified. Character should never require permission to be treated with dignity." Nathaniel paused just inside the ballroom and looked around the beautifully prepared room. Nothing about the polished tables, rare wines, or elegant surroundings had changed. The only difference was that people were finally seeing one another with clearer eyes. Sometimes the finest thing preserved over time was not found inside a bottle resting in a cellar. Sometimes it was the wisdom earned by admitting a mistake, choosing humility over pride, and allowing respect to arrive before judgment ever had the chance to speak. Nathaniel Brooks accepted the crystal glass William Harrison offered him, but instead of raising it immediately, he looked slowly around the ballroom. Faces that had greeted him with doubt now watched him with genuine respect. The room had not changed because of an expensive collection of rare wines or carefully arranged decorations. It had changed because truth had quietly replaced assumption. William stepped beside Nathaniel and smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin tonight's tasting, I would like our guest of honor to share a few words." The ballroom grew completely still. Nathaniel looked across the audience without searching for sympathy or applause. His voice remained calm, steady, and warm. When people hear the word vintage, they think about patience. They think about time revealing quality that could never be rushed. Character works much the same way. Every guest listened closely. Nathaniel continued. "A bottle should never be judged by the dust on its label before discovering what it contains. Neither should a person." No one interrupted. Richard Collins stood quietly near the entrance, reflecting on every decision he had made that evening. Emily Carter remained beside the registration table, grateful she had trusted her instincts instead of ignoring them completely. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward them before continuing. "Every person who walks through a doorway brings a story you cannot see. Some stories include success. Some include hardship. Most include both. The question is never whether someone deserves dignity after you discover who they are. The question is whether you offered dignity before you knew. His words settled gently across the ballroom. They did not accuse anyone. They invited everyone to think. William nodded with quiet admiration. That is exactly why we wanted you here tonight, he said. The guests raised their glasses together, not because protocol required it, but because appreciation had become sincere. The tasting finally began, yet conversations sounded different from those that had filled the room earlier. People introduced themselves before discussing careers. They asked questions before offering opinions. Even Richard found himself welcoming late arrivals with renewed attention, making certain every guest received the same courtesy regardless of appearance. Before the evening ended, Richard approached Nathaniel one final time. I cannot change the first impression I gave you, he admitted. But I promise I will remember this lesson every time someone walks through these doors. Nathaniel smiled. Then tonight accomplished something worthwhile. Emily joined them holding a revised guest registry. This time Nathaniel's name appeared at the very top exactly where it belonged. She laughed softly. I think this version will stay exactly as it is. Nathaniel smiled. Sometimes the most important corrections are not made on paper. They are made in people. As the evening came to a close, guests departed beneath the same stars that had welcomed them hours earlier. The elegant estate looked exactly as it had before the first misunderstanding. The stone entrance remained unchanged. The chandeliers still glowed warmly. The vineyard stretched peacefully into the distance. Yet everyone who left carried something more valuable than a memorable tasting. They carried the reminder that respect should never depend on recognition, wealth, reputation, or appearance. Nathaniel quietly walked toward his car without seeking photographs or praise. William watched him leave with quiet gratitude, knowing that the greatest contribution Nathaniel had made that evening was not financial support or business leadership. It was the example he had set by answering prejudice with patience, misunderstanding with grace, and judgment with unwavering dignity. Long after the final guests returned home, many would remember only one sentence from that unforgettable night. The finest vintage is not the one that waits the longest to be opened. The finest character is the one that never asks to be recognized before choosing to do what is right.